This is hugely disturbing, isn't it? The bottom line is, if people run out of money, the energy stops. That can't be allowed to continue, can it?
Well, it's really shocking, actually, because it's not just Ofgem finding that there's been an increase in the number of people being cut off. The actual numbers are unbelievably high. So last year, Citizens Advice found that 3 million households were cut off at some point during the year on prepayment meters. And part of the answer to this was meant to be smart meters, which of course you can have either as a prepayment meter or if you're paying on credit, and then you'd be able to manage your energy more carefully. But that doesn't seem to be working if Ofgem, and Ofgem obviously is right to report that more and more people are finding themselves without the money to be able to continue their energy supply. Now, yes, this time of year, that's perhaps a little less important, but when it comes to December, January, February, this is potentially a disaster in the waiting.
And it's a bit too cute, isn't it, to call it self-disconnection, which is what I gather the industry does, and maybe the political people. They call it self-disconnection, but basically it's because you just don't have enough money to feed the meter, and so you get cut off. And you can be cut off for, well, apparently there was a huge amount of people cut off for more than 3 hours. And they're not self-disconnecting because they want to. It's because they don't have the money. And something's got to be done about that. It feels very cruel to suddenly have no electricity because you literally don't have the money to put in the meter.
Yeah, I think it's a basic human need that you need to have enough energy to heat your home, to cook, to ensure that you can have a reasonable standard of living in a society like ours. And the reality is that what the energy companies have done historically is if someone can't afford to pay on their credit arrangements, then they get bumped over to a prepayment meter and they have to pay up front. And that's about 15% of households now. So we're not talking about small numbers, but there's a double whammy here, because if the energy companies bump you over to a prepayment meter, it actually costs more than it does on your credit account. So these are, you're being really hit two ways, and the squeeze on people when you've had such big high food inflation, the squeeze on people at the bottom end of the income scale who are struggling to make ends meet is really acute.
But how do we balance that out? Because it all sounds like common sense. We can't allow people to run out of energy. But if they're being provided with energy for free, even if it was just for some basic things, which is ultimately what we're talking about, well, that's got to be A, paid for by someone, and B, it's got to be monitored so only people who are actually in that position are claiming that benefit.
Yes, absolutely. You can't go handing taxpayers' money out for nothing, and it's absolutely crucial that you target it on the people who really need it. But let's take one step back and look at the sources of this problem, because you can get energy use down very dramatically. So, for example, between 1971 and 2005, we got energy use down per household by 37% a year. So that was pretty dramatic. Now, we had an enormous energy saving program to make our homes less leaky, to be able to save energy, which was introduced with the coalition government in 2010 and began to really retrofit serious energy saving measures. That was unfortunately scrapped by the Conservative government in the subsequent general election when they got a majority in 2015 by George Osborne, in fact. Now, if we'd continued with that, we now know from studies we would have had energy bills 25% less than we now have, at least. And it would be technically possible to have had energy bills half of what they were. Now, that was an unbelievably short-sighted thing to do. Lots of rather silly backbenchers saying, no, we mustn't continue with this, it's adding to costs. Well, boy, we certainly would have added to costs then in a very minor way. But by not doing it, we've massively added to costs. So the government has got to stop being short-termist about energy-saving measures. We have the leakiest, worst old housing stock in Europe. And if we can get that much better, which we can easily over time, and we need to build up the people with the skills to help us do that, then we can get energy bills down and make people much, much more secure. So, I'm afraid that sounds slightly Irish. I'm saying we shouldn't be starting from here, but we shouldn't have scrapped that scheme. And if we'd continued it, the Treasury would be a lot better off. Taxpayers would be looking at a lot lower subsidy than they've had to fork out over the last couple of years in order to get people through this energy crisis. And I'm worried about what's coming up next winter.
Well, that's it. We're talking in July, and this coming winter, things are going to get worse because if we don't do something. And could any of the schemes you've mentioned, could anything be done in time to help people come this winter?
Well, there is. Our neighbours on the continent in Europe set a target to save gas, for example, by 15% last year, and they managed to get gas demand down by 17% in 1 year. That's using a whole load of different measures, including some sensible timing and guidance about how to cut down on energy use. We only managed to get our energy demand down last year by 7%. So we could do nearly 3 times better if the government took a more active role in encouraging people to save energy in this crisis. And that would help everybody. The obvious things, which are very cheap, no regrets, make sure you've got enough lagging in your roof space, make sure that you're trying to deal with seals around doors, pump up a balloon in any chimney stacks that you've got so that you're not losing heat through the chimney place. I mean, there are a lot of really cheap, quick things that you can do. But if we want to handle this for the long term, we've got to ensure that our very old housing stock, which dates back, a lot of it, to before the First World War, actually has enough insulation. And that requires a big program, which can't be done in time for this winter. But we mustn't be so short-termist ever again.